Hello everyone, and welcome to the August edition of the Farmers Supply Association Agriculture Report. I'm Randy Kopechka, agronomist with Farmers Supply Association, and I was glad to say that word August. You know, it's one of my favorite months of the year. The crop season is wrapping up. Harvest will begin in August. Football season begins in August. Just a great month in my opinion, my favorite month. So glad to be taping here on August the 7th, and just going to talk about what's going on in our crop situation in our area right now, the Farmers Supply Association trade area. Again, harvest begins this month, so we're kind of winding down. Most of my calls over the last week or so have been really about two things. One, an insect situation in our soybeans and our rice, and the other thing, we're starting to get some calls on irrigation termination. About finished up on corn and getting a lot of calls now starting on rice. So that's what I want to talk about today. First, briefly, the insect situation, and it's really been a pretty good year so far. You know, I was thinking that we're going to blow up, especially with our rice stink bugs. We're seeing some in the field before heading, but it's heading has began, and now a lot of our rice is already turning yellow, as you can see behind me. The head's turning over and starting to turn ripe. The stink bug situation is really not ever blown up. You know, I've recommended 2 or 3 treatments where we were at or above threshold, and some other guys have sprayed some stink bugs, especially some of them are put out a fungicide right before heading, and they go ahead and throw an insecticide in there because it's really pretty economical to do that. But really the numbers have just never exploded. You do need to keep an eye on these, or keep sweeping these fields through about 60% hard door, when about 60% of that head is turning the straw colored look. So you know, even though we haven't had a big stink bug year, don't really expect it. Sometimes these late fields will get infested, so let's keep an eye on these fields until 60% hard dough. The soybean situation with insects, much the same. We keep thinking things are going to blow up. They've blown up certainly in South Arkansas in many areas. Up here, there's been some soybeans sprayed, and I've recommended spraying some fields, but overall the numbers have just never exploded. You know, getting a lot of 5 for 25 sweeps, those kind of numbers. The treatment threshold is now a dynamic threshold depending on the price of how much it's going to cost you to spray and what the cost of beans are, and take those things into effect. If you're using the more economical insecticides, the cheaper ones with no residual, the generic pyrethroids and things like that, then the threshold is about 5 or 6 worms per 25 sweeps. If you're using the more expensive treatments that do have a significant residual in them, then this threshold goes up to about 10 to 11 worms per 25 sweeps. And again, really, I've had some numbers certainly in that 5 to 6 range, but not many in that upper range. I just had 2 or 3 fields that I've seen those kind of numbers in, and even in those they were real small worms. And we got to remember that if those worms are less than a ½ inch long, then a lot of things can happen to them. We're seeing a lot of beneficials in the nets and things like that. So, you know, if they're little bitty worms less than a ½ inch, we need to just kind of ride them out and check the field again if we've got time to do that. I know sometimes it's hard to check the fields that often, but if we can do that, it's better to just wait and make sure those larvae materialize and get to the size where they can be more damaging and not as influenced by the beneficials. So that's where we're at right now. Let's keep an eye on our stink bugs in our rice, our corn earworms in our soybeans, but again, they've not blown up, so hopefully it's not going to be a bad insect year. Again, as I mentioned, we're getting calls about irrigation termination. In corn, it's pretty much there. At corn, we go generally about 50 to 75% starch layer. Pull that ear off, an average ear off, shuck it, and break that cob in half, and then take one of the kernels from that middle of that cob and slice it lengthwise and see where that starch layer is at, where it's the hard layer is at. If it's generally about 75% or more down the kernel and you've got good moisture, you're in good shape. If it's on furrow irrigated corn, sometimes you can even stop a little earlier than that, but I generally like to get to about 75% with good moisture in corn as a general rule, and you feel pretty good about that. And again, a lot of our corn, most of our corn is now there, so we're about done with corn. Rice, you can see this field behind me is almost perfect for draining. 2 or 3 rules of thumb on rice. When I first started being a county agent, they always told me, if the end kernels are brown, if the bottom kernels at the base are milky, then you're generally pretty safe to terminate irrigation, drain the field. we've got a couple of rules of thumb that the Extension Service in Arkansas uses that I think are real good rules of thumb. Number one, look at that head, that panicle. If it's straw colored for about 2/3 of that panicle, if the end 2/3 are straw colored, then you're generally pretty safe to drain. That's on silt loam and lighter soils. If it's a heavy clay soil that takes forever to dry out, then only about 1/3 of that panicle needs to be straw colored, and then you're pretty safe to drain. Another thing we look at is days from 50% heading. If you're 25 days past 50% heading, then you're generally pretty safe to drain the field. With long grain varieties, medium grain varieties, we like to leave it a little bit longer because it takes longer for that big fat kernel to dry down. So on medium grain varieties, generally need to go about 30 days past that 50% heading to drain. So again, we're taping August the 7th. I've recommended draining on a few fields. Most of them are getting really close, like the field behind me. I think it would be safe to be drained now. So we're getting there real quickly. We've had pretty much been on the fast track with all the hot weather we've had. Lastly, soybeans. Of course, we're a little ways away on most of our soybeans. We always used to say if the beans got to R6, which means the seed we're touching within the pods, you could terminate irrigation there. But a lot of good research over the last 10 years or so show that we need to go a little bit longer to maximize yield. So we go to what we call about R6.5, which is generally about the time that your pods or your plants are starting to turn color just a little bit. You're starting to see a little bit of yellowing and browning. Generally, that's where you're at, is that R6.5. Another thing you can do is open that pod up, and if those soybeans have separated from that white membrane in the pod, and if you've ever opened a bean up about late maturity, you know what I'm talking about. But that bean will become basically loose within that pod. It's not attached to that membrane, and once it's loose, obviously it's not taking in any more moisture or anything else. So the seed weight has been established there, and it's just a matter of dry down. So when you get to that point, again, looking from a distance, if you're seeing a little color, and again, to be more accurate, open that pod up, and if you're seeing those beans separated from that membrane, then you can go ahead and terminate irrigation on that. So again, it's August, we're getting there. Harvest will start later this month for both corn and rice, I think, and we should be going full bore when we do our next report in September. And I think our yield potentials are pretty good. We've had some good weather here lately. Temperatures have moderated. We've had pretty good sunshine, so I think we've got a chance to fill these grains out and have a good crop, and hopefully we'll have a good crop and a good harvest season. Until next month, this has been Randy Kopechka with your Farmer Supply Association Agriculture Report for August.